Radio check. Loud and clear.
KSL Sports and KSL Podcast present Mode Push, an American view of F1, starting now.
And I'm stuck. This is what you get with this honestly.
I'm gutted. I'm absolutely gutted.
I enjoyed this so much. Thank you.
Welcome on in, everybody. It's another edition of Mode Push, an American view of F1, the podcast brought to you by folks at KSL Sports, KSL Podcasts, and we appreciate your support so dang much. Alex Kirry and Dan Jimenez. Dan and I have had some homework to do this week, and that is we were forced to tell our wives, hey, I've got to binge watch this F1 show on Netflix. I'm sure you'll understand. And, of course, I'm sure your wife was just as understanding as I was. When I was just, like, walking around, she's like, so that's what you're watching then. That's what you're going to be watching is the new Drive to Survive season. And that's what I did for the last couple of days. But it's just so we can give our listeners, Dan, a view into what's going on here.
Yeah, it's part of the grind. You know, we just got to put in the work. And my wife was kind enough to sit next to me through maybe half an episode, and then she was off doing something else. But she was on her phone the whole time. So yeah, most of my viewing was over the just on the AirPods and the iPhone.
My wife tries to mitigate the watching at the same time, like watching the phone while a show is on. She'll do a show like in a foreign language, and then you got to read the subtitles, and then she's like, oh, looks like you got to put your phone down. Here we are. It's another season of Drive to Survive, Season 5. This is how I got – I mean, there's a little bit of a nostalgia here. And it's wild to think, too, that I got into F1, Dan, basically like so many other people who maybe listen to this podcast or even got into F1 in the last couple of years. I would dare say, too, that the explosion that you've seen of American interest is almost – purely driven by this series on Netflix, Drive to Survive.
Totally. I totally agree with that. It was kind of around season 2, season 3 is when just random folks in my life who had never previously cared about anything that I ever did before in racing started coming up to me and being like, hey, I'm started watching this show on Netflix and it's really interesting. And I kind of like that Daniel Ricciardo guy. And it was just really weird because I'm like, wait, what? Like, I've been the nerd since I was like 12 watching Formula One. Nobody cared about it. And now all of a sudden it's popular. But yeah, I'm totally with you. I think it's been a genius move for Liberty Media. And it's, I think, at the root of the explosion of F1 in the U.S. right now.
So among all this, the Drive to Survive drops. So here's kind of the timetable here. Drive to Survive drops this week. And, 2 days, I guess it was officially only a day ago. Yeah. And so that drops. Testing is going on right now. Race week number 1 is in T-minus, a few days. So we're already getting into the first race of the season next week. We'll have already been through qualifying at this time. And that's it's a really good way to do it because you go, okay, you want to just get a quick jump into this sport because that's how it worked for me. I watched the first season and then I went, oh, I guess there's like a couple weeks till there's an actual race. I'm going to try to dip into this thing. And that's the genius of it, and that's why it's been working. But there was definitely this season 5. There were still these moments, and we can go through. But I want to go, I want to go through a little bit like blow for blow, kind of the episode to episode, a little bit of how they did this because it was interesting the storylines they chose to do in these first 5 episodes, and then we'll do the next 5 episodes next week. But winter testing, like actual stuff that's going on right now, because all this that we're watching is, happened last year during the 2022 season, and it's done, it's finished. But right now we're in the midst of teams trying to figure things out, getting their laps in with testing. What have we learned from testing so far, Dan?
Yeah, so far we've learned that Red Bull's still fast and still very confident in their car, and Max is saying that there's more performance still to come. Sergio Perez laid down the fastest lap of the test session, which is, it's kind of hard to say who actually gave it their all and who was still running around with, a lot of fuel or just not in total full qualifying trim or full engine power mode. But from the information that we have, Red Bull's still fast. Mercedes is still having some problems. Ferrari's quicker in a straight line, but slow in the corners. And Aston Martin looks to be the fastest of the rest, which was a surprise. So a lot of storylines carrying over from last year, but some new things that I think are going to make the start of the season exciting.
I was actually watching today because Will Buxton, he's been a major part of my life the last 36 hours because he's featured so much in Drive to Survive, and he's an F1 employee, and you know he's overly dramatic, which works out perfectly for the series. You know, when he explains, you do not want to lose against your rival, and you're like, wow, the revelation, amazing. I did see him say this though about McLaren, who, coming out of testing, has, what I've seen is they've had the fewest laps completed, which could kind of indicate something, you know, of an issue there. That's kind of usually something that they tip to Williams, you know, but this is McLaren's issue. And I actually saw this clip and I thought, I got to play this for Dan because not all is well for Zach Brown's team.
I actually saw him leave the garage and walk to the little driver's room on the side, and very unlike Lando, sort of punched the flimsy, you know, sort of makeshift wall as he walked through. It was, you know, I wasn't going to knock the wall down, but it was there was that little bit of frustration as he walked through. And just, you can tell it's not quite.
So there was a little insight there. Now, if the Drive to Survive cameras are walking around for season 6 already, it'll be there'll be some dramatic music. There'll be maybe a couple extra cuss words that are thrown in there. That being said, when he said it's a very non-Lando-like, we've seen Lando kind of with the 1,000-yard stare the last couple of seasons with this team, and the development of McLaren is not going well.
Yeah, it is not a good start. I think that stat you shared that they had the fewest laps in practice is the indication of who's having the most trouble, because what you want to do is you want to iterate to a good setup, and then you want to be able to make long runs on that setup to learn as much as you can over the course of a long run. But if the car is not acting, you know, the way that you want it to, then you're like, okay, 2 laps, bring it into the garage, make a change. 2 laps, bring it into the garage. And so you just end up losing a lot of time doing those changeovers and trying to run a bunch of different iterations. So yeah, that's the signal to me that that development has not gone well in the off season for McLaren, which stinks because I mean, I think the McLaren brand is great. Like Zach Brown being the American team principal is really cool. We all love Lando, Piastri's the golden boy. Like there should be a lot to be excited about, but it just sucks that they can't get their act together on their car.
I did see an interesting piece of, speaking of teams and their lap totals, things like that. AlphaTauri actually finished everything with the most laps completed, and which is fine. I think it's great. You know, the little brother team of Red Bull, which is kind of the space that they've lived in for, you know, a long time, and they're the developmental team, and some teams being able to have that or at least a partnership within it. I've got some interesting news. Did you read this today, Dan, about the future of what Red Bull is thinking with AlphaTauri?
I saw some headlines that they might be for sale.
Oh boy. The new Red Bull management has determined, this is according to Toby Gruner, who writes for a German F1 coverage over there. It's all of the entire article's in German, but like the headline that is in English right here says that the Red Bull management has determined that the results and the marketing value of the team does not justify the cost. The team either has to move to England or it could be sold. You have people waiting in the wings. You have people who are willing to put up capital. You know, and AlphaTauri's been an interesting thing. Like for somebody like me who just doesn't go, I've already not seen the value. When I see that they have like the AlphaTauri like clothing line rolled out, I'm always like, I don't know what they're doing here, but God bless them. Maybe it works for them. Maybe the European market is big for it. But does that make sense for some place where an Andretti Cadillac situation where you could kind of just like sneak in there and do? I don't know how that works. Like, or would you just have to have? How do you sell an F1 team, or what do you do? Sell the name? I'm not sure what happens.
Yeah, it's a great time to sell an F1 team. I think it's top of the market when it comes to the popularity of the sport. So if you're Red Bull and you've ever been thinking about in the past, you know, maybe we should divest this, now's a great time because you're going to have a line of buyers, I think, wanting to get in. Exactly the mechanics of how that all works, I'm not sure. It's interesting too, knowing that Ford and their new partnership with Red Bull probably wouldn't love Red Bull selling the team to Chevrolet to get into the sport, for example. So I wonder how that might influence it. And then whoever buys the team, will they still be a Ford engine customer? Like, you know, they have been like the Honda customer paired with Red Bull is another question going through my mind. But I think it's great. Like, you know, Red Bull has done so much for the sport. They just are an incredible marketing machine. They've thrown so much money into it. But I think that in the end, they're like smart business people, and they see that the return on that AlphaTauri team just doesn't make sense. It's not the development like the driver development team that I think they were planning on it to be, because like so many of the drivers have just gone off elsewhere, and they've, other than Max, like they've just been pulling drivers in like Sergio from completely other teams. And so I think it makes sense, and I'm excited to see who steps up. I think it'd be a good thing to diversify, two of the cars on the grid into another ownership group.
Interesting to see those types of developments happen like right before the season starts, like that type of drama, like as if there wasn't enough pressure on all these team principals and the bosses and everything. Like Franz Tost must be just beside himself going, great, I'm glad that this stuff leaks out while we're sitting in here, trying to get this season going, and you almost don't even have time to listen to that noise. Let's go to some of the episodes that have happened during for the Drive to Survive Season 5. I was, as we started to go through this, so you have 5 episodes. The last one having to do with Alpine, and then there was a full Mick Schumacher episode entitled Like Father, Like Son. There was a team principal kind of driven one in episode 3 that really kind of showed a lot of the lack of, I don't know. It was all of Ferrari's struggles on the side of trying to figure out these races and how many times they screwed up, basically. When they magnified all of those problems into one episode, and you know that Mattia Binotto ends up at the end of this thing with no job, it's pretty sad to see, because you're like, they're trying their butts off to make this thing happen, but they fumbled so many dang times. Well, let's start with the first one. They start to go through the season. One of the things that I think we forget about, because it's such a long season, is just how difficult it was when they first showed up and all the cars got out of their garages and everybody starts looking at them and walking around the paddock. Everybody looked at Mercedes and went, you guys are either geniuses or this is going to suck, and it ended up being the latter. Right,
yeah. That was interesting to see, like Lewis coming over and looking at the Ferrari, just like, this is really different than ours. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And yeah, I love that first episode. Gunter is the star, I think, or he's one of the main stars of the show. And they leading off with Gunter and Mattia driving through the Dolomites in that little tiny Fiat or whatever they were in.
Yeah.
I love that. That was great. Like, it was very endearing.
I didn't even know they were that close. Like, I would assume some of these guys have known each other obviously for years and years, but like to hear Gunter throwing around the Italian, and obviously he's kind of right there on the border.
Yeah.
I think he's from that like the border of the Alps there between Germany and Italy. So I think speaking Italian is like not super wild for him, but to see him over there, and I think it was Mattia's, was it his vineyard that he has, or like a winery that he started over there?
Yeah, they went to some vineyard. They said he's getting into that, but I don't know if that was his exact vineyard. But yeah, that was cool to see, but it was hard because you're like, oh man, I really like Mattia. He's a cool guy, and I just know he's not going to make it.
Right. You know how it ends with that guy. There are some things
like
where,
Old Yeller. You're just like, I know how this movie ends.
And it's hard too, because you have to go back. I mean, the Silverstone race was featured across at least 4 of these episodes, like pretty heavily, like just each kind of story or each team that they were kind of following. Because Silverstone ended up being the race, I think, where Mick scored his first points overall. And again, the ending of what happens to Mick, and you saw how difficult it was. And to hear the Gene Haas phone calls with Gunter after these wrecks that he had, and he's just like, this guy didn't have it. This guy didn't have it, man. And this guy, we're getting into dead man walking territory. You're talking about Mick freaking Schumacher, and you're just going to cast this guy aside. And yeah, it was a couple of weeks in a row of losing, almost $2 million worth of a car. But to watch the Mick Schumacher episode was really difficult because, one, you have Gunther Steiner, who they have this really quick car and they just can't put some things together. They have kind of just Haas issues that they seem to have. And yeah, and you just see these guys who go in and they don't necessarily live up to what you thought they were going to be. And you and I have talked about this. I don't know how a team wouldn't take Mick Schumacher. Maybe you and I just don't see, or maybe I don't see that he is so bad for the sport, or was so bad during his first few weeks to be not good enough to give him a seat ever again. Yeah,
I think it's a bit of kind of victim of circumstance that Mick is having this issue at Haas, where Gene Haas is just very direct with his drivers, and he's very businesslike in that he does not want wrecked cars. And that goes across Formula One or NASCAR or anywhere he's raced and, building his own business, that he's just very savvy like that. So I feel like Mick at any other team, they would have given him a longer leash. So it just kind of sucked for Mick that he was at Haas, where they were going to be more critical with the cost that he was incurring on the team. And it really, I think, comes down to destroying the car at Jeddah and qualifying and destroying the car, I believe it was during the race at Monaco. It's like 2 cars gone. Like if he's not counteracting all of that with a bunch of points, then in Gene Haas's mind, the decision is very clear, and he's a pretty emotionalist dude, and it doesn't care what your last name is. So yeah, that was rough to watch.
And they bring up his relationship with they bring up his relationship with a bunch of the drivers, and obviously Sebastian Vettel, who crosses over with his dad, during that time. That's also that's a difficult one to watch, and a guy who's been his mentor and trying to figure it out. That was a tough episode. I think that watching some of the success, what's been the theme so far in these first 5 episodes, and they bounce back and forth, but it's pretty obvious that Ferrari really, really messed up last year. They had all this talent, and they try to make this. I think it was when Carlos Sainz finally won his first race, and that was at Silverstone, right? And they kind of let him. Yeah. The team orders were like, "Hey, give Leclerc 10 lengths. You're on these old tires, and he's going to defend Lewis." And they kind of made it sound like that Carlos Sainz was like, "No, screw you guys. I'm going to do this thing." But they just kind of I think the reality of it was the more dramatic thing that they did was try to act like he defied team orders in the episode, which it wasn't actually that at all. It was more along the lines of, hey, he just kept pushing back and going, you guys, his tires are old. He's obviously slower. Look at his times. And then they finally kind of relented and said, yeah, you can try to pass him here. And he got his first win. They definitely tried to make a Charles versus, Carlos kind of a little bit of a grumpy attitude. And I think it was more to do with the fact that Charles was underperforming and had to watch in some races where Carlos was overperforming. But Carlos had some dogs of races, too, so many DNFs across it. Right now, Ferrari's leading the screen time, I feel like. They're getting a lot of attention, and we're sort of forgetting the fact and glossing over the fact, and I'm sure we're going to get in the second half of the season, of the Drive to Survive season, that they're going to focus a lot on how dominant Red Bull was. Right now, they're just choosing to forget about that and focus on the teams who and it was difficult, too. Same thing. Watching Mercedes, they did a full episode of We Don't Know What We're Doing Right Now, and the team principal meeting where they were getting fired up at each other. That's my moment of the season so far.
So far is awesome. That team principal meeting. And you have to think that team principal meeting lasted a lot longer than what they showed, and that they selectively edited a bunch of the comments. But it was very interesting to see Toto crack. And he cracked when he asked, when he told everybody, look, what you guys are doing to these cars to get them to not bounce is unsafe. And if you put a driver in the wall and hurt them, then I'm coming after you. The logic there is just galaxy brained, so out there. And you see all the other team principals roll their eyes. And Binotto, I think, had the right response. He's like, dude, safety is a team's responsibility, right? Leave it to us to make sure our car is safe. And you're just coming up with this weird straw man argument on about the porpoising because you have a problem and you need to fix your car. And I wonder if Toto was just being overly dramatic in front of Stefano Domenicali, the F1,
yes,
or I think he was the one that was there kind of leading that F1 conversation.
Yeah. He was like, hey, and that was funny too, because Gunter wouldn't shut up at the beginning of the meeting, and he's like, Gunter, can we please have a moment here? And it felt like me, all of junior high. But when they do cut to that moment where And Christian Horner goes, should we turn off the cameras for this part? Because this is a really aggressive thing. He's like, no, keep them on. He's like, no, keep them on. He's like, okay, I feel like you're doing this for the cameras, though, because this sounds like a really weird thing that you would come after us for our safety issues when obviously making the argument of it's not working for us isn't good enough because everybody else made changes, probably to the detriment of their aero, on their cars, to try to figure this thing out. And the episode, that same episode, with Lewis walking around holding his back for the entire thing, the whole thing was very, very dramatic, I think, by Mercedes. But I think that was the play that they made all last year during that time too. Oh, look at us, we're it's like being tripped on the soccer pitch and then looking at the ref going, you didn't see that? Like, what's going on over here? Like rolling around. They're just rolling on the pitch till somebody reacts, and they didn't get the reaction, and so they're not used to losing. Feel
like, Toto was pulling like a total Neymar there and just trying to get the F1's attention, because if we remember, like leading up to the summer break, that's when they made rule changes that benefited Mercedes and hurt Red Bull. At least that was like what everyone was guessing was going to happen based on ride height stuff. And so I think he was just trying to build that story as to like, this is a safety issue. You know, you're going to break Lewis's back. Someone's going to end up in the wall. And if F1 doesn't change the regulations, then something bad's going to happen. It's going to be on them. So I think it was very performative to him just trying to stir up this thesis and hopefully getting F1 to react to it. And they know that like Lewis has a ton of media power and pull, and so he just has to make a couple of Instagram posts about like, you know, this is bad for my back, and you know, the fans are going to be outraged.
All right, any other things that you were like, oh, for sure I got to bring this up, the stuff that stood out to you from the first 5 episodes here? And like I said, next week we're gonna bring up a lot more, and but other things that stood out to you so far. We haven't heard from a lot of the teams yet, obviously.
Yeah. In episode 1, it was pretty early when they were talking about Haas and Nikita Mazepin and that whole issue. I thought that was pretty interesting to see, at least how Netflix portrays it, how cut and dry that decision was for Haas, to know like, hey, we have like a basically like almost privatized Russian oil as the sticker on our car.
Right.
And the, you know, sponsor's son is in the driver's seat. And it was just like, he's out. And the comment that Gunter made about like, I never want to see a Russian the rest of my life. I can't remember exactly what he said.
It was like something along those lines. He's like, freaking Russia, man. If I have to dealing with Russians, I never want to deal with Russians ever again as long as I'm still on this planet, or something like that, or like until I'm off this planet. And
it was a good quote.
It was classic, because he's like, does these interviews, and he's like, yes, and we're keeping our eye on the situation. And then and then it shows him walking back, and the PR guy, and he's like, gosh, I freaking hate Russia right now. Like, this is the worst. and it was. I mean, you think about, and it was a massive blessing in disguise, because they upgraded their driver situation immediately. By bringing Kevin Magnussen in. And it was cool to see K-Mag, like how he's changed. They show his wife and his kid, and he's like, I have just a totally different view of how I'm going to approach things now, because my life is totally different, even though it's, you know, only 16 months later or whatever it was. And so that was cool to see him. I'm wondering how they're going to portray, you know, the situation at Red Bull. I think they're probably, if they're smart, I want to get a little bit more into the Checo-Max relationship, and I'm hoping that we find out a little bit more. We've seen a couple of times with Max in the interview seat, which means there's potential there to actually maybe have a response back and forth, and I think that's going to be something that, one, it'll be over dramatic like we've seen, but I think there was a lot more there. There was a little bit more meat on that bone than we probably realized between you know, the two of the best drivers on the grid, and the best team certainly. I'm waiting to see that. I don't know what happened with Williams and how they figured things out. All of the new drivers being added mid-season and toward the end of the season, that's also going to be really, really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the appeal in prior seasons for Drive to Survive has been these inter-team driver rivalries. And we haven't really gotten that through the first 5 episodes of this season. So I'm with you. Like I try to think back to last year and be like, okay, where were the real driver rivalries going on? It was, like you said, towards the end of the season with Max and Sergio, and then also Alonso and Ocon. And they didn't really touch on the Alonso-Ocon relationship very much in that episode 5. It was more like Alonso and Otmar, the team principal, more kind of their relationship. So, yeah, I hope they get into that. I think that's kind of some of the meat and potatoes of Drive to Survive, is seeing these guys get super competitive. And you kind of had the moment where Carlos like stormed off the pickleball court after losing, I think, to Charles or something.
Right, it was, yeah.
Seemed like overly dramatic.
And you're like, I know. And then he's like, I'm such a freaking competitor. And you're like, they all are. Like, I get it, but there's probably overdoing it with this one here with the pickleball. I
just wanted to be like, dude, pickleball is not a sport, man. Just get over it.
I think like his dad was like a professional squash guy for a minute. After
it must be
like,
squash, yeah.
Like he did squash for a while, and I think that Carlos has inherited his dad's ability on the squash court. So whatever, the squash problems, like if you're going to be like, that's the kind of stuff you're supposed to do to get away from the sport of it. Other things that I'm interested to find out, I hope we get a really good view into, and they teased a little bit toward it as well, and we saw a little bit of it in the Alpine episode, but like the Fernando to Aston Martin and the suing of the whole Oscar Piastri thing that just went down in such a weird way. All that stuff, I want to get more clarification on all that as well. That's the kind of drama I love.
Yeah, I thought that episode 5 was the best episode so far because it left on a pretty great cliffhanger there with just Piastri tweeting out like, I have not signed and I will not be racing with Alpine next year. And like that really just rocked everybody's world when he sent that tweet out. So that was a good midpoint for the season. And man, I loved Alonso's grin when he was like, I'm still the bad guy, and like gets up and stands up and out of the chair. And you just know like he's out there to look out for himself. And yeah, he just wants to get paid in his final years in F1. And that's what Aston Martin was able to bring to the table. Do we
end up seeing Sebastian Vettel maybe having to fill in for the moment while Lance Stroll isn't 100%?
And how great would that be? I mean, it would be super cool.
Those two guys on the same team would be awesome.
Those two on the same team. I mean, that's like how many world championships between those? Would that be 7? 4 and 3?
6.
4 and 2?
Did they have?
6.
Yeah, I think it's 6. Yeah, because I think Fernando's got 2.
And then plus like all the hype around how fast their car is, that would be pretty cool to see. Just like even if it's just one race, to see how fast Sebastian would be in that car.
Right.
And we don't want to wish harm on anybody, and I really hope Lance gets healthy sooner. But it seems like such a Lance thing to do is to get hurt on his bike.
Right. And and on top of it, like I think all of us know, hey, who's the weak link on these teams usually that are owned by Lance Stroll Sr. Like none of us really look at Lance Stroll Jr. and go, hey man, this guy, he's supposed to be the future of this. To have a Fernando and Sebastian Vettel, even just like a few races at the beginning of the year, that'd be nice. But yeah, it looks like Aston Martin's got a quick car, so looking forward to that one as well. As we go into this next week, I mean, are there teams who are? I mean, the car is always in development, right? I mean, that's kind of the thing with the sport. But what is the reality of like when everything has to be totally buttoned up? Or are there teams that are going, yeah, we get to race one and we're not going to be competitive at all. We're just going to try to kind of get our stuff going for this first race of the year.
Everyone's bringing everything that they got to this first race. I think like we talked about in the last episode, like hope springs anew at the beginning of each season, and you come into it thinking we can win races and we can win the championship. So I think everyone's going to bring everything that they can. I know that some teams like Mercedes have already kind of hedged a little bit by saying like, oh, we've got some more developments coming later on in the year, like 3 races in or 4 races in. But I don't think anyone's holding back coming into this weekend.
So far, dark horses race-wise, not even necessarily team-wise, but knowing what we do a little bit of who these teams are and who could surprise, maybe like Haas did at the beginning of last year.
Yeah, I think Fernando and the Aston could be a surprise dark horse win. Who else? Man, I really wanted to say Piastri, but McLaren's just looking so slow that you probably can't attribute anything there. So, and then Valtteri in the Alfa Romeo is really quick. I think he was like second or third. I think he was third fastest in testing. And I think he's still in the prime of his career and has that competitive edge. And he's got the like the mustache and mullet helmet. Did you see that?
Yeah, no, I think I put that in our F1 group on Twitter because I was like, it's such a Valtteri thing to do where it's like they're like, what kind of a helmet do you want? He's like, I don't know, make it look like my mullet. Like he's like, I don't care. I don't care about the helmet. Just make it and it'll be fine. But yeah, I'm always interested to see what a guy like Valtteri can do. I think Alex Albon, I'm not sure how quick the Williams is. I'm always like hopeful that team can turn it around just because it's such a, they've been on the back foot since I've ever followed the sport. But I think that Alex Albon's a really good racer, and I think that he's a guy that could really, really do something interesting if the car is even close to being decent, because I think he's a really talented racer.
Yeah, I that's going to be interesting because Logan Sargent, I'm just looking up the timetables. He was actually faster than Alex in testing, And Alex even got to run the last day when most everybody was posting their fastest time. So, yeah, I think Williams could make a leap forward, and hopefully Logan can stay out of the Mick problem and not wreck a bunch of cars, because like Haas, Williams doesn't have a ton of money to put into new chassis. So I'll be interested to watch Logan for sure.
All right, Dan, it's another episode in the books, man. I've just been, I know it probably feels all over the place because we just have all these things. We're basically kids who are like, remember what happened in that one movie? It was freaking awesome, man. Like, that's basically what we've been doing the entire episode here. So I'm interested to see how these next 5 episodes go. And then we're going to have a race preview next week as well. So we'll drop midweek-ish a race preview and our final 5 reviews of the final 5 episodes of Drive to Survive. Dan, thanks for hanging out, man. Appreciate it.
Thanks, man.
There you go. Dan Jimenez, Alex Curie. It is the Moat Push Podcast, an American View of F1. Download it, subscribe, rate it, review it, send it to a friend. Let's talk F1, man. We're getting into it. For Dan and Alex, we'll see you next time.